Thank you very much, Mayor Cull, President. I'd also like to acknowledge Malcolm and his amazing team from LGNZ for pulling together this amazing symposium, as well as all of you here, and a lot of familiar faces in terms of mayors, councillors, and a whole lot of other amazing people who are working day in, day out to improve the situation that's confronting a lot of our families and whānau and our communities, the land of breath in the country. And fundamentally, I'd also like to just put it up front that everything that the Ministry of Social Development is trying to achieve when it comes to the public social housing part of the housing continuum, everything we are doing cannot succeed without the likes of yourself, the likes of the amazing community housing providers and other support providers who are working day in, day out in our communities to try to make a difference to whānau and individuals who have got a lot of complexities in their lives and are either in states of insecure housing or just quite simply cannot afford any private rentals. So I'd like to acknowledge that up front, that's quite important. For this afternoon, I have a couple of slides. I'm not going to read them rote, I will just go through them. In part, what I wanted to do was to share with you today some of the work that we're doing in communities around the country as it touches upon winter this year, and then through to Housing First, the program that we're increasingly now rolling out around the country to really address chronic homelessness, which is not just in the main centres. We know it is something that increasingly a lot of us in our communities are experiencing beyond the main centres. And then to finish off, I'll quickly touch upon the aspirations, but also what we've been able to achieve in recent times when it comes to the transitional housing portfolio that we've been rolling out the length and breadth of the country, as well as just an acknowledgement of some of the stuff we're trying to achieve more in terms of public housing, which I'm very conscious, Minister Twyford this morning when we were all here, he shared with you the strong aspirations that the Minister has when it comes to increasing the supply of public housing, as well as other parts of the housing continuum. Fundamentally, when we think about housing, and I typically prefer to talk about homes, because I think housing sometimes doesn't really give us a true sense of the value of a home to individuals in whānau is so fundamental to addressing a lot of other issues that might be in play for their lives. And when I am talking about what we're trying to do in the context of the public housing part of the housing continuum, whether it's addressing homelessness, thinking about emergency and transitional housing, or long-term public housing, it's all about building communities. It's all about how we can have far stronger, more vibrant communities that are resilient, but also far more responsive to the needs in our communities. And these are just a few pictures over the last 6 or 12 months of some of the work that we've been doing with our amazing partners in the communities to deliver more homes for people who need them. We're already into winter, and I know a number of us had to wear some coats for today and this morning. And a couple of months ago, most of you would have been aware and picked up that the Prime Minister and Minister Twyford made an announcement in Te Puya Marae up in South Auckland around the commitment the government has to this coming winter to ensure that the proposition we're working upon for winter is really focused upon delivering far more houses than what we've done in recent times for winter, to make sure the Ministry of Social Development is far more responsive to people in need when they can turn up in our offices or contact us, and then more fundamentally, that we are rolling out throughout the course of winter, a little over 1,500 new houses that will span the transitional housing portfolio as well as long-term public housing. And then at the same time, we're looking to fast track some of the new Housing First initiatives so that we can actually have Housing First coming on track in the new areas faster than what we were originally planning. For us to do that, that fundamentally relies upon a huge ability from our partner providers and also you, the councils, to help us make progress. And when I think about the progress, what I'd like to touch upon is actually how we're tracking. How we're tracking as at the end of May. So we set a target that throughout the course of winter, by the time we hit the end of winter this year, we were aiming to add 1,500 houses spanning across transitional and public housing. As of the end of May, we're over halfway. We've got a little over 800 into play. It's very important that we're upfront about this. So every month we're updating these numbers on the MSD website. This is the latest table that's on the MSD website. It gives you a sense that particularly in transitional housing, we've really brought on quite a lot and we're ahead of what we're thinking achieving. And on the public housing, over the course of this month and next month, we're expecting significant more numbers of more long-term public houses entering into play for communities. I'd like to just highlight a couple of things. This truly is the length and breadth of the country. It is not just the main centres. For example, these numbers include the transitional houses we brought into play in Blenheim. It includes the more transitional houses that were brought into play in Hastings and the wider Hawke's Bay. That used to be seasonal worker accommodation. We now have a provider taking care of those facilities and working with the whānau who are now in those facilities. It includes the additional supply we're bringing in Northland, as well as the additional supply that we're bringing in elsewhere around the country. And that's quite important because I absolutely acknowledge, because we see it every day, that the pressing need for people to have homes to be able to give them stability is way beyond the main centres in New Zealand in 2018. And a lot of what we're trying to achieve here is really trying to bring on that supply in a faster way. I'd also like to just note, and as I know the Prime Minister and Mr. Twyford noted, that clearly there'll be certain times, but in certain communities, that this supply will still not be sufficient to meet the demand that we have in communities, which is why we'll be continuing to rely and use the emergency housing special needs grants, which we do, and that's where we use a special needs grant to have whānau individuals placed into motels. Again, we're going to continue using that. That's not our preferred option. It's really one of the tools in the toolbox, and probably the last tool we'd like to move towards, because when someone presents, we would love to be able to get them straight into a long-term home. If we can't do that, and if nothing's available, then it will be transitional housing that has support providers in play, helping stabilize things and make sure they can have every opportunity to move into long-term accommodation. The other area that I touched upon, again, it's an important part of winter, but it is Housing First. Housing First is an internationally recognized program that we've now had in play in New Zealand for the last 18 or so months. We spearheaded it out of Auckland with 5 amazing providers who have really made a huge difference to over 280 individuals who have been chronically homeless. And those 280 individuals have now been given the opportunity to have a home and have the right wraparound service accompanying them to give stability and introduce them for a platform so they can actually sustain long-term housing into the future. Housing First is an intensive program. It really is. It puts housing right at the first cab off the rank. It's about getting that person into a house and then wrapping around all of the right services to make sure they can have every opportunity to sustain a home long term. The interesting thing, and this played out in Auckland, and again, how we're rolling out Housing First around the country is going to be different depending on the community we're going into. And I know that the huge opportunities we now have in Christchurch with the amazing providers, including the council, that we've worked on to roll out Housing First there, that is a model for Christchurch that we believe is going to deliver something strong for Christchurch. It's not necessarily the same way we've approached it in Auckland. Same with Tauranga. Again, I'd like to acknowledge the council in Tauranga and all of our amazing providers there as we roll out Housing First in Tauranga. And we're doing the same here in Wellington. The council here have been amazing working with us and all the relevant providers to now start pulling together a strong proposition for Housing First here in Wellington. The other interesting thing I just note is, and Auckland indicated, is because Housing First is a strong commitment by MSD, by the government, with the providers to deliver something significantly different for people who are chronically homeless. What we've also seen in Auckland is a sizable number of the homes that we now have those individuals in are actually private rentals. And that did surprise some of the providers. Now, one of the reasons, and we're still exploring all of this, but one of the reasons is because it's the provider who is reaching out and negotiating the private rental. And behind the provider is MSD. And we are giving assurances on a financial level that we're in here for the long haul. And we're going to ensure that property is looked after and that individual is well looked after and supported. Now, I've touched upon the areas that we've already started to see Housing First rolling out or about to roll out. And I know for a number of you, you would be aware that with the budget this year and with the announcements we've been rolling out and the engagement we're doing, we're aiming to be introducing Housing First into a far bigger penetration into the regions here in New Zealand. Rotorua, Northland, Napier and Hastings, and Blenheim and Nelson are going to be the areas that we're going to look at in the first instance, but quite frankly, we want to be working with everyone where there's a need, where people are identifying a need, where we have chronic homeless situations, that we will want to work with yourselves and the providers we have in play in each community to see if we need to think about Housing First being introduced elsewhere. But these are the areas we're now looking at to roll it out, because these were the pressure areas where we realized the huge deficiency in supply, as well as some of the circumstances of the communities, had resulted in areas and pockets of chronic homelessness. As I said, obviously there's a number of component parts when you think about public housing, and I've been more talking about probably aspects around the harder end, around the homelessness, and Housing First is an important part of what we're responding to, as well as our winter package to ensure that no one unnecessarily should be in a car or in a tent or anywhere else in our communities, because reaching out to MSD, we're going to leave no stone unturned to make sure they have a far better proposition than a car or an overcrowded garage or anything else. But thinking about the wider public housing supply, I just wanted to share with you that the latest numbers as at end of March are really all around how we can go faster to bring in more supply. Minister Twyford spoke about the huge aspirations for the government that in the next 4 years we're bringing on at least 6,400 net new public houses, the length and breadth of the country. We've been working for the last 12 to 18 months with a huge commitment already to explore the length of the pipeline we can do to bring on more supply. We acknowledge that that still is relatively untapped, but I'm heartened by the pipeline we have that is already delivering new houses, more public houses in a lot of communities today. The key message I'd like to share with you is that we want to be able to work with you to explore everything we could do to bring on more, and explore how between MSD and then in a couple of months the new Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, but how we in central government can be working with yourselves and other people in our communities to deliver a far better proposition for whānau and individuals in our communities. That's fundamental. And what might work in Auckland is not necessarily going to work in Kaitaia. It's not necessarily going to work in Blenheim or Nelson, but we know that working with you, we're going to come up with the opportunities that will work for our communities. And that's, for me, a key message I want to share with you, that we really have a strong commitment to be able to work with yourselves to deliver something far stronger. Now, I've touched on transitional housing, and I wanted to share this with you, and this maybe gives you a sense that transitional housing, again, it's not the long-term proposition, and quite frankly, if we could get the supply in a far better state with the demand, we would not need the scale of transitional housing we do. But transitional housing is an important part of what we're trying to do, because it gives us the opportunity of working with a provider on the ground to stabilize people as they come out of insecure housing or a homeless situation, and allows us to work with them. On average, it takes about 3 months around the country, and in fact, the national average is probably, I think, about 10.8 or 11 weeks of the amount of time people will be in a transitional house before we move them and can secure a long-term home. That's the national average. Clearly, in some communities where we have a continued deficiency of supply, then the average in some communities might well be higher, and in other communities, lower. But in the last 18 months, you'll see that there's been a huge growth in transitional housing, and it is around the country. Yes, because of Auckland and the population base, that has a sizable number, but you just have to look there that communities around the whole country is actually seeing a supply increase of transitional houses. And as things currently stand, with our commitment to winter, and as the Minister indicated, we're already over 2,300. So yes, we had that target, but quite frankly, when people are in need and whānau are in need, we're not going to stop at that target for this winter. We will make sure we go over, because if people are offering us more supply, we're going to take it and make sure we introduce it for people in need this winter. And then finally, I touched upon it. Again, it's an area, it's not our first tool in the toolbox to reach for, but I will acknowledge that the Emergency Housing Special Needs Grant continues to be quite a strong part of the toolbox. Unfortunately, that continues to highlight the deficiency of supply in communities. We are experiencing, and the March numbers was indicating that we're probably looking at an increase into winter, but nonetheless, it is a valuable part of what we're doing for whānau and individuals who are homeless or in insecure housing, because it means that we'll provide the motel that they can have an opportunity just to stabilize things before we can get them into transitional housing or long-term homes. I think fundamentally, I want to ensure that when anyone does present the length and breadth of the country, that the Ministry of Social Development, people can see a strong heart in all of our officers and huge passion and caring, that when someone is in need, we are going to be working with them shoulder to shoulder to deliver a far better proposition for them. Okay, so I thought